All right, everybody. Hey, I'm Howard Tiersky, and you are in the Winning Digital Customer Show. Welcome. And today is St. Patrick's Day. Are you excited? Now, if you're probably some people, for St. Patrick's Day is a day of massive partying, and for others, St. Patrick's Day is just another day. Hey, Caitlin, can we put my slides up? But thank you. There's my partiers, my St. Patrick's partiers. Okay. So I thought, let's talk a little bit about St. Patrick's Day. And I have to admit, it's a day I associated as a Jewish kid from Chicago. I have to admit, I didn't have any special knowledge. Sorry about that. I didn't have any special knowledge of St. Patrick, but I did a little research and actually found out some interesting things. And it made me think of some things that I think might be very relevant for us all to think about today in honor of St. Patrick, but also important business lessons that we can take from the story of St. Patrick. So are you ready for some business lessons from the story of St. Patrick? All right, well, let me start by asking you a trivia question. Does anyone know the real St. Patrick? Does anyone know where he was from? If you're like me, you probably say, well, Ireland, of course. And the answer is no. St. Patrick was not from Ireland. St. Patrick was from England. And as I think a teenager, he was captured by slave traders and he was brought to Ireland as a slave, believe it or not. And he then lived in Ireland for a number of years. I forget the exact number. I think it was 4, 5, 6 years, something like that. And then he escaped. He actually had a vision, so the story goes, that he should stow away on a ship and escape Ireland back to England, which he did. And he escaped slavery. And then a couple years later, living free in England, he had another vision that he needed to go back to Ireland to bring religion to the Irish people. And so that is what he did. And is, of course, his experiences in fulfilling that mission that he felt that he had in his life, or that he received from his vision, which turned him into somebody who is so revered and appreciated and famous, and, well, for whom we drink green beer every March for. So I guess you could call him a success. There's all kinds of stories about St. Patrick. I mean, what he did, chase the snakes out of Ireland and other things. And there's probably a lot of it that's apocryphal or just downright mythological. But in any case, and I have to admit, I don't know a lot more about St. Patrick than that. But here's one thing that I think is interesting about the St. Patrick story is that it starts with tragedy. It starts with a horrific situation of him being captured and enslaved. And it's quite an interesting story of somebody who becomes enslaved, escapes, and winds up going back to the place he was enslaved and winds up being a hero in that land. It actually reminds me a little bit of the story of Joseph in the Bible, another story, and you're probably familiar with that story, but I'll give you the 30-second version. Joseph is the youngest of a whole bunch of brothers, and they are all jealous of him because the father, who is Jacob, the father is Jacob, one of the patriarchs of both Jewish and Christian and Muslim religions, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So one of Jacob's son is Joseph, his youngest son, or second youngest son, actually, to be precise. And his brothers throw him in a pit to kill him. And then slave traders, back to the slaves, come and buy him instead. They decide to sell him to slave traders. The slave traders take him to Egypt, sell him into slavery in Egypt, and through his cunning and also his dreams and his skill at interpreting dreams, he rises through the ranks in Egypt, and he finally winds up being the second in command of all of Egypt to Pharaoh, and basically like the vice president, if you will, of Egypt. And he helps lead Egypt through a very difficult time where there's a great deal of famine. So that's the story of Joseph, and I see interesting parallels. Now, what does any of that have to do with business? Two different religious stories. Well, again, in both cases, we have a tragedy, a horrible situation which occurs, but which is really the seed for the greatness that that person achieves ultimately later in life. One might presume that had St. Patrick never been enslaved and forcibly taken to Ireland, he quite probably would not have chosen to go there later and proselytized and been a leader of religion in Ireland. And similarly, one might theorize that had Joseph remained a shepherd outside in the lands far outside of Egypt and not had this horrible thing happen to him, he may well never have become the massive success and had the massive impact that he had. Now, of course, you could take a fatalistic or a destiny mindset and say, oh, it would have happened some other way. And I won't argue with you about that, but only to say that in these stories, these terrible things that occur are the seeds for something much greater later. And I think that's a really interesting idea for us to bear in mind, because as business leaders, and in our personal lives too, but I'll focus my comments here, as business leaders, we're almost certainly going to be encountering problems. I hate to say it, but I think it was Donald Trump who said that business is problems. And if you don't have any problems, you probably don't have a business. And so the reality is, when you embark on any kind of transformational leadership effort, you are bound to face problems, some of which can sometimes seem disastrous. And so I want to talk a little bit about that in the context of a mindset to have about that. And so thinking about these stories, St. Patrick's story or Joseph's story, or other stories that have similar patterns, as perhaps something to help you through those difficult times. So, one of the things that I've often been aware of this book, and I've sent it to people who found themselves fired from a job. If you haven't had a chance to check out this book, We Got Fired, and it's the best thing that ever happened to us. And it's stories about people like as you can see on the cover, people like Larry King and Michael Bloomberg, who at some point in their career had a job that they were fired from. And there's a variety of different stories in this book, but inevitably what it turns out to be is that being fired somehow either gave them the motivation to do something greater themselves, or gave them the change, the time to do something, or opened a new door, or shifted their perspective, or did something that actually led to something great. So this is, of course, a great example of it's not only for when you get fired, but again, that mindset that says, if something bad is happening, or when something bad happens, it just actually might be the seed of something great, like for St. Patrick. I looked around. I was familiar with this book, but just to see on other topics, I found books on so many similar themes. Here's another book that I hadn't heard of before. My Husband's Affair Became the Best Thing That Ever Happened to Me. Now, I confess I have not read this book, so I don't know exactly why it was the best thing that ever happened to her. But I could imagine different reasons why it could be the best thing that could have happened to her. Maybe it ultimately brought her closer to her husband, or maybe it helped her realize that he was a bum and she needed to move on, and that led her to find someone else to be with. But in any case, that's another example of the theme that I'm talking about. Another story out there. And here's another one. Cancer. One of the best things that ever happened to me, a testimonial. And, we never wish for these things to happen. We never in a million years wish any of these negative life events on anyone, myself, my family, any of you watching. And I imagine you feel the same. So it's not about chasing these events because they're going to lead you to something good. Of course not. Of course not. But on the flip side, we all encounter difficulties and challenges. And it can be helpful when those times occur, or even to plant that seed in advance in your mind so that you're a little bit pre-inoculated. We're all getting vaccinated now, thank God. This is another kind of a vaccine. It's a vaccine against bad things that could happen to you. It's not going to prevent the bad things, but sometimes the key when bad things happen is how you respond to them, and how your mindset, and how you focus on getting through them and getting to something great on the other side, instead of being weighed down or paralyzed by them, or becoming someone who's less effective in your ability. You need to be at your maximum effectiveness during challenging times. And so often the irony is the opposite happens, right? We become angry or upset or depressed or despondent, or angry at ourselves, or we feel guilty, or whatever it may be. And those negative feelings make it harder for us to be effective. So I offer you the story of St. Patrick on St. Patrick's Day, but also the fact that it really is only one example of a story that you can see patterned over and over and over in lots of different places, as something to bring to the front of your mind when you get that call, or when you get in that car accident, or when you get that bad news from a doctor, or whatever it may be. Again, never wishing these things will happen, but let's face it, in life, these things will happen in some form or other to us, to people that we love. So let's just talk a little bit about some specific examples in a business context. Oh, wait, before I go to that slide, I wanted to mention this. So, and just two fun quotes I wanted to share with you along the same theme before I get to some specific kind of business examples. The other day for the Ides of March, we did a whole show on Shakespearean quotes that relate to transformational leadership. So don't worry, I'm not going to give you 10 more Shakespearean quotes today, but I want to give you one more. And this wasn't our last show, which is another quote from Shakespeare. There is nothing either bad or the good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Now, I don't know that I entirely believe that. I'm not going to sit here and say that it wasn't bad that St. Patrick was enslaved. Of course, horrific. So sorry, William, I'm going to argue with you on that point. But I think the larger point is a good one, which is, in the end, in the grand scheme, in the larger picture, your mindset about what happens to you, and particularly if it's something bad, can be transformational in terms of whether that thing in the end turns out to be the worst thing in your life or, the best thing in your life, or as certainly was the case for some of those books that I mentioned, or even if it's not the best thing in your life, turns out to be something that you make a stepping stone to something better. And I just want to share with you as well a quote from Tony Robbins. Those who know me well know that I'm very involved in Tony Robbins events, and I've been he's a client of ours, and I've worked with him and with his teams and everything for many, many years. And honestly, I really believe he's one of the great geniuses of our generation. So if you haven't had a chance to expose yourself to his books or his podcasts or his events, I strongly suggest you do so. Any preconceptions you have about Tony Robbins that may come from infomercials from the 80s, I would encourage you to start with a blank slate, because he's got a tremendous insight into human psychology and how to help people live happier lives and be more effective and more successful. So enough with the Tony Robbins ad, unpaid, but those are the best kind, right? But here's a quote from Tony Robbins. What if life was happening for me, not to me? And he talks about that in the context of tragedy in life, or problems or bad things that occur. And how would your life change if, instead of having the mindset of you're a victim and something bad has happened to you, instead have the mindset that everything that happens in my life, I may not understand why, but it's happening for me, to help me, to get me to ultimately where I need to go. And with the fullness of time, looking back on the story of St. Patrick, it certainly does seem like his capture by pirates and enslavement was something that was happening for him, to lead him on his ultimate journey and his ultimate destiny to the role that he was meant to play in history. And I'm sure it didn't feel like that when he got thrown onto a pirate ship, and I'm sure he suffered in many ways. And again, one would never wish that suffering, but the irony is, when you look back on the bigger picture, it's also undeniable, or nearly undeniable, that that was an important part of his journey to the greatness that he ultimately accomplished. So I promise you some business applications of this, and I've touched on them, but let me just give you some examples of some things that can happen in business that seem really bad and may turn out to be wonderful. First of all, there's something called the customer recovery paradox. And essentially, when you fail a customer, when you let down a customer, you hopefully do your very best to deliver an outstanding customer experience. But let's face it, sometimes it doesn't happen. And sometimes something horrible happens. The flowers you were supposed to deliver to that customer for their wedding don't show up on time, and there's no flowers at that person's wedding. Or something, you're a restaurant. My wife was once in a restaurant, a very, very expensive, fancy restaurant, and they brought her food out, and hers was chicken, and she cut into the chicken, and it was completely raw in the middle. I don't know what they did. They probably got two people's chicken orders confused, and they were supposed to cook it for 20 minutes, only cooked it for 5 minutes, whatever. But, just terrible, terrible things can happen. And of course, you may feel terrible about those things. But here's the idea of the service recovery paradox, which is that when you take that bad situation, if you take the right steps to recover with that customer, to make it right for that customer, and to make sure that that customer recognizes the emotional investment you have in making them happy, and your sincerity of your sorriness, your apology for what happened. It was not what was intended. It was not because you didn't care. You care a great deal, and you are prepared to make it right. Very often, not only can that undo the negative, but actually it can counterintuitively strengthen the customer relationship. Sometimes when something bad happens, when you screw up, it can actually give you the opportunity to demonstrate who you really are and how much you care and how far you're willing to go to make something right. And that can actually leave the customer with an even more profound appreciation for what you do. So the opportunity to take a screw up, and if you Google this idea, service recovery paradox, it's written about extensively. Ritz-Carlton in their thought leadership often talk about this idea that they empower all of their associates, the people behind the front desks of a Ritz-Carlton, to spend money up to $1,000 or something like that if needed, to make it right for a customer, for a guest, whatever it may be, because they recognize the power of that. So that's the first business application of this. Something bad happens, and you can actually turn it into something great. Let's look at another. The loss of a key resource. So I've had this happen many times in my career. You build a team, and maybe you've got some superstar linchpin person on that team, and one day that person walks in and says, "Hey, I'm getting married. I need to move across the country." Or, someone came and offered me another job and I'm going to take it, and you can't match the offer. Or it's just a better it's just a different opportunity. I remember one time a superstar, a technical guy that worked for me came to us and said he was leaving. And I said, "No, we really don't want you to leave. You're so critical here. What can I do to make you stay?" And he said, "Well, nothing, because my dream is to open a restaurant. And my cousin and I have gotten enough money together, and we're going to open a restaurant together." Like, well, what am I going to do about that? Right? I can't convince this guy not to follow his dream. But it was a huge problem for me, a key critical person that we were counting on. And all I can say about it, and again, you don't want your key people to leave, but when they do, what I've seen over and over and over is that others step up. You find new people, either existing people that you have, use that vacuum as an opportunity to grow in ways that maybe you didn't realize that they could, or someone else shows up. You go out and recruit the next person and you bring them in, and very soon you realize, oh, wow, that was a tremendous opportunity when that person left to bring in this other person, and they may, who knows, be even more of a rock star. Or maybe they're not more of a rock star, but they just bring something new and different to your organization, and you never would have had it had that person not left. So that's another business situation where someone key leaves, and it might just turn out to be the best thing that could have happened. I'm going to give you two more, and then we'll get out of here so you can get to your green beer. Number 3, business reinvention due to competitive pressure or market rejection. Look at Apple. They were nearly out of business, right? They were failing to innovate. They weren't effectively responding to the marketplace. Their culture was screwed up. Their process was screwed up. And they were so desperate that they turned around and bought Next Computers, Steve Jobs' new company, because they had repeatedly failed. At the time, if you remember back in whenever the heck that was, in the late 90s, early 2000s, when they were trying to create the next generation version of the Macintosh operating system. And they tried for several years, and it just failed. It was like bad code. It was buggy. Like, they were not succeeding as a technology company at creating the next generation of the key software that runs their computers. And it was that failure that led them to be so desperate as to pay a premium for Next Computer to get Steve Jobs' next operating system called the Next Step operating system. And that was ultimately what brought Steve Jobs back to the organization. Next thing you know, iPod, next thing you know, iPhone, iPad, iTunes, and all of the innovation that has now made Apple one of the most successful companies in the world. So, but it was born out of failure. Had Apple been more successful at creating the next generation of their operating system, they probably wouldn't have gone and paid all that money to acquire Next, and they probably wouldn't have gotten Steve Jobs. And who knows where they would be today? It's very hard to predict, but my guess is they wouldn't be the most successful, valuable company on the planet. And I'll give you one more. Oh no, I promised you one more. There isn't one more. That's all I got. Okay, well, sorry for the bait and switch, but there you go. That is the bad thing that just happened to me. I thought I had a 4th bullet point and I didn't. So how am I going to turn that into something great for you guys? Now I have to demonstrate what I said. I've put myself on the line here. I don't have a 4th bullet point. What would be a 4th business application? Let's see. I already covered business reinvention. So I think, another situation would be, I mentioned getting fired earlier, but you get your job within an organization is threatened or gets eliminated or you get demoted. You're on a path within an organization. And for one reason or another, maybe you're leading up a major project that gets killed, or maybe somebody politically undermines you and you all of a sudden, the thing that you're leading, you're no longer leading and you get pushed to the side. There's an opportunity in that. Sometimes you wind up in one of these jobs where you're not even sure what your next job is. They're still paying you while you're, consulting to the CEO or whatever. This type of moment can be an opportunity to leverage all that you know about the organization, all that you know about the customer, but free yourself from the constraints of the path that you were on and say, okay, if that path isn't succeeding, What are all the other possible paths? How can I create more value for this organization in a totally different way? And who knows, that might lead you to an opportunity that no one else would be able to come up with, because you're the only one who, number one, has the knowledge, because it's hard for someone on the outside, not impossible, but hard for someone on the outside to really figure out what the next big thing that a company needs is, because they don't understand the company. They don't know its culture. They don't know its mission. They don't know its product line, its challenges, its manufacturing issues, its politics, its customer base. They may know some of that, but they probably don't know it as well as somebody who's been on the inside. And the people who do know, they may not have the time, right? Because they've got something there. They've got something else that they're charged with, just like you did before you got brushed aside. And now all of a sudden you find yourself with both the knowledge and possibly some spare time to go think about what that next great thing could be. And maybe hopefully you also have some credibility. Even if your project got brushed aside, you're a known entity there. You have the opportunity to come back and bring something new to the organization, and as they say, make lemonade out of those lemons. So anyway, so that's my my made up on the spot possible fourth example, and hopefully this has been interesting to you. It's certainly been interesting to me. I didn't know the story of St. Patrick before I started researching it for today's session of today's show, so I was interested to learn that. And I really do think it's an interesting pattern that we should all have in mind, because we're all going to encounter setbacks. We're all going to encounter failures. My hope for you is that those will be mild, that you will not suffer, that you will not have great challenges and grief in your life. But if I'm realistic, knowing the number of people that watch this show, I'm sure some of you are suffering with great challenges right now, whether they're from COVID or other kind of health issues or business challenges or whatever they may be. So I'm sorry for your challenges. I wish I could take them away, but of course I don't have that power. But what I have the power to do is to try to give you some thoughts, some content, some ideas, some ways to think about things. And maybe those are even more valuable to you in the end, maybe, if you take them and you're able to then follow that path like St. Patrick and turn your challenges into the seed of your destiny and your great future accomplishments. So with that, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much for listening, for watching. Have a great St. Patrick's Day. Have a beer on me, and I look forward to seeing you next time.